Great. Excellent. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm John Colborn. I'm Executive Director of Apprenticeships for America, and just couldn't be happier to be talking with you today about a report that we've had in development now almost really over a year. Um, and really, our ambition with this report is to answer the question, can apprenticeships grow in the United States? We have a president who said that we should grow apprenticeships from our current levels, which I'm told 696,000 apprentices in the United States, grow that to 1 million. At Apprenticeships for America, we think the number can be far higher than that. We target a number around 4 million, and Harry will walk you through some of that math. Um, and when we raise that with people, we often get the question, yeah, but how do you grow? How do you grow apprenticeships from where we are now to 4 million? And what's more, given the historic underperformance of the United States around apprenticeship growth, there's a lot of skepticism about the growth of apprenticeship. So we wanted to put together a report that would answer some of that skepticism, offer multiple roadmaps for growth, and then be able to use that analysis to inform our policy work and our programmatic work at Apprenticeships for America. And so, with that as background, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Harry Leach. Many of you know Harry. Harry's been with Apprenticeships for America for now a year and a half, a year plus, and has really been the thank you, Zach, and has really been the driver behind this report. When he came on, I said, I think we need something like this, and he's just been diligently taking notes, looking for opportunities to frame this work. So we'll be presenting now almost a year's worth of work on this growth report. Let me just say, and I think it's in the chat. We will be sharing a recording of this on our YouTube channel, so anyone who is not able to participate can watch it there. And the report itself is going up on our website. Harry, is it up now or?
Not yet, but we'll get it
Okay, we'll
up
be
after
going up on
this.
the website right after this webinar. We'll be sure to send you a link to that, as well as the slides from this session. So I think with that, I'm going to turn this over to Harry. We're going to not do direct introductions for folks on the call, but maybe you could just put in the chat your name and organization, just so we have a sense of who's here. And as always with AFA, and especially today because we have a smaller crowd, feel free to just raise your hand if you want to ask a question or make a comment. Also, make comments in the chat. We actively monitor that. And as we sometimes do, we'll have a little bit of a time after the webinar just to talk about whatever else is on your mind. So with that, Harry, I'll turn this over to you.
Great. Thanks, John, and hi everyone. Great to see you. So there's quite a bit to cover. I'm going to go through a bit section by section. I've got some highlights of the report, not the full thing. We'll share that afterwards. And I'll pause as we go through for any discussion, comments, questions. So please feel free to use the sidebar or put your hand up and comment at any point. I just want to add a little bit to John's context before we get started, and then we'll go through. So, a bit of the genesis of this work. We often talk about, we think the US should be at 4 million apprenticeships. That number, where that comes from, I'll go through a little bit later. That comes from international comparisons, where the US should be if we were in a similar place to international peers. And that's a kind of rigorous way to do it, but it's top down. So, a lot of this work, we wanted to look at the same thing, but more bottom up. Where are those sources of growth? And we also get challenged on that quite a lot. 4 million seems like a long way away, right? So we wanted to show that it's achievable by looking at different options together. And then final bit of context, I'd say up front, a bit of a caveat. This is mainly sort of analytical work, looking at different numbers, opportunities, using it to kind of guide our policy thinking, the areas we should be thinking about working on. This isn't a blueprint. We think there's a lot of like different ways that we can grow our apprenticeship, different possibilities for expansion. So this isn't like a, exact plan. This is more, here are all the different ways that apprenticeships could grow and the things we should think about to catalyze growth. Great. I'm gonna start on slide 2, just with a bit of a summary of the whole report. So I think this is an obvious point to this audience. The case for scaling apprenticeships is really clear, both on the learner side and the employer side. We know the need, but we're just nowhere near where we need to be. We're at, as John said earlier, just under 700,000, where we should be at around 4 million active apprentices in the long run. So in the report, we identify what we think the most important sources of new apprentices are. That is in kind of decreasing order, increasing youth participation, expanding in those new non-traditional occupations, increasing retention, and changing the incentives to convert unregistered apprenticeships to registered. And then we also will get into looking at the kind of levers that are going to stimulate that growth. So there we think the biggest opportunities are, no surprise to long-standing friends of AFA, the growth and development of multi-employer intermediaries is the kind of number one factor, number one lever there. And then other areas we think are really important, significant potential to stimulate growth: state policy, community college adoption, the growth of apprenticeship degrees, and the growth of apprenticeships in the public sector. So those are all the areas. Those are kind of top messages, areas that we'll go over today. So now I'm going to go over that in a bit more detail. I'm just going on to slide 4. So I'm going to start a bit with why this matters, why we care about scaling apprenticeship. Not going to spend too long on this. I think this is a kind of familiar topic this audience doesn't need convincing of. But it's a little bit hard to interpret, but this is a bit of a shocking graphic. So this looks at the kind of typical destinations of a high school cohort after they graduate, as they kind of track through post-secondary education. So in kind of really simple terms, the blue are kind of good destinations and the purple are not so good. So if you follow it through, you've got 3.7 million people graduating from high school every year, just over half going into higher education, 1.4 million not continuing education. At the moment, a really tiny proportion, we think around 14,000, going into apprenticeship in the next few years outside of high school. And then going further in, of those going to 4-year college, over a third aren't graduating within 6 years. Of that 1 million that graduate, just under half are underemployed. So that means working in a job that probably doesn't really require a degree. It's a pretty similar story with 2-year college. Of the 600,000 there, 360,000 aren't graduating within 6 years. So taking a step back, adding that up, that means around 3/4 of those people going into higher education aren't really getting the outcome that they're after necessarily. Either they're not graduating, they're dropping out, or they're ending up in a job that doesn't necessarily require that qualification. So I think it's pretty clear there's something a bit broken in the transition between education and the labour market. The report also looks at the kind of case for apprenticeship growth on the employer side, why there's a need for employers to think about new and more flexible routes to reach people. I'm not going to touch on that today, but because of time, but we cover that in the full report. So the next question we have is, what is that right level of scale? Where should we aim for? So AFA uses this number of 4 million active apprentices. Where we get this from is the middle column on the chart here. If the US had the average amount of apprentices other countries have, we'd be at around 4 million. That basically works out as 2.3% of the labour market. being apprentices. The thing we wanted to show here is this isn't necessarily the kind of most ambitious number we could choose as a target or goal. We think it's actually probably pretty reasonable. So if you look on the far right hand side, we've got a real success story in apprentices in construction in the US. So 4.6% of the entire construction labor force are apprentices currently. If you extrapolated that, if we had the same, policy, funding, support that we've got in construction across all occupations, if we got to 4.6% in every occupation, we'd be at, nearly 8 million apprentices. So there are kind of more ambitious ways to cut this. If you look at that next column, second on the right, if you looked just at youth, if you had the same proportion of US high school students going into apprenticeships as you do in Germany, we'd have nearly 5 million apprentices. It's not on this chart. If we had the same saturation as Switzerland, we'd have well over 8 million apprentices. So anyway, there are different ways to cut this. We wanted to show like a range of different options to show actually that 4 million, it seems about right to us. It's not saying we need to get to the best of the best. Actually, it's saying if we can just get to the average of the rest, we'd be in a good place. Going on to the next chart. So this is looking at growth over time. It pulls together, what's happened in the US over the last decade, and compares that to the rate of growth we've seen in other countries. There's 2 points that I take from this. I think the first message that we put out from this graph is we're not going to get to 4 million anytime soon without intervention, without the right policy and funding. Even sort of continuing at the current rate of change of the last decade, which has been pretty good, it will take a long time to get up to the level that we should be at. But the second message, slightly more optimistic one, is other countries have had like a really steep rate of increase. If you look at that French one, the green line on this, that's the kind of growth of French apprenticeships over the past 5 or 6 years. That came from a really significant program of policy reform. So they expanded apprenticeship massively in higher education, introduced apprenticeship degrees, and put in pretty significant incentives for employers. And apprenticeships have shot up. They've nearly doubled in the space of 3 or 4 years. So, it's achievable, but it takes that kind of level and scale of intervention if we really want to see that level of growth. So I want to quickly just touch on a bit of analysis we don't have in this pack that's in the full report. We've done a bit of analysis of the kind of barriers to scale. And I think the message we want people to take away there is supply isn't really a barrier for us right now. The barrier that we need to concentrate on is employer demand and employer adoption, which I think, again, will be obvious to any practitioners in the field. Just unpacking that supply side a little bit. So, thinking back to that high school cohort, we've got around 14,000 people taking an apprenticeship out of that 3.7 million. So that's just 0.4%. But we have over 75% not necessarily getting the outcome they need from post-secondary education. That's a kind of, there is an enormous scope of people who could benefit from an alternative pathway, scope for expansion amongst young people. If you look at incumbent workers too, there's some great analysis from a few years ago by the Burning Glass Institute at Multiverse that showed that probably around 3/4 of incumbent workers could benefit from an apprenticeship. There's different categories of people we go through in the full report about how they could benefit. But, adding those up, we have an enormous supply pool of people who could potentially benefit. And we also looked at awareness. There's signs that, awareness of apprenticeship is growing. Survey results increasingly showing young people favoring, sorry, John, if you just stay on that one. Young people increasingly favoring work-based learning routes, apprenticeships becoming, people are more aware of apprenticeships as time has gone on. So that leaves us with our big barrier being employer demand. That's a kind of one of the big messages we'd like you to leave you with. We don't need to worry too much about supply right now. It's really all about, getting more employers to sign up. Um, Back to this slide. I want to talk a bit about those sources of new apprenticeships now, where we think growth is going to come from. So we have youth as a really big source of supply here. The left-hand side is the kind of US, what's happening, how many are currently taking apprenticeships, bachelor's, high school graduates. The right-hand side is Germany, where 56% of people are going into apprenticeships. Most countries range from 40 to 70%, Switzerland at the top end with 70%. So putting those numbers into a US context, if we got to just 10% of the US high school cohort taking apprenticeships, which, is a lot more than now, but doesn't seem too ambitious in the context of other countries, that would mean 360,000 new apprentices a year. I just want to note, so that's kind of new apprentices starting, given we're talking about multi-year programs, that would equate to around 700,000 active apprentices. So that alone would be kind of double what we've got now. Just going on to the next slide, turn into the occupational slide. So occupational side. So we've got a few different cuts looking at occupational data in the main pack, what type of jobs we think in an expanded apprenticeship universe apprentices are going to be doing. This is a really simple cut of the data. This is just saying, what would the numbers be if you took 2.3% of each occupational group? How many apprentices would you have? So this is quite a crude way to think about it. I don't think this is exactly the distribution we would end up with, but there's some interesting points that come out of this. And we also done a comparison with, some other countries, what their actual occupational distribution is. It's actually ended up quite similar. Two messages here. Obvious point, room for growth everywhere except for construction. Every occupation we can make significant progress in, except for construction. I don't think that will come as a surprise to anyone. I think the second message is, if you took just a couple of occupations, if you took areas where other countries have got a really significant apprenticeship pipeline, so healthcare, manufacturing, education, kind of business and administration, we're talking about really significant numbers. So just taking the top three here arbitrarily is over 500,000 new apprentices per year, over 1 million active apprentices. There's plenty more of the kind of occupational analysis in the main pack. Going on to the next slide. So there's a couple of other areas we wanted to highlight as kind of sources of new apprentices that we think it's important to think about now. The first is unregistered programs converting to registered. So we don't really have any data on unregistered programs, kind of by definition. Anything can call itself an apprenticeship. It's not a protected term as it is in other countries. This is taking some work that Bob Lam did a few years ago. Using survey data, he estimated there's probably about as many unregistered apprentices as there are registered. So there's probably around 700,000 now. Right now, there's very little incentive for those programs to register. They'd be going into a regulatory system without necessarily any carrot. So if I think it's probably a pretty safe assumption that if you had the right incentivization, if funding was available, kind of depending on your status of registration, many of those programs would register. So we think of this as kind of a really immediate source of new apprenticeships. They already exist. So especially for this administration, if they're worrying about getting to 1 million, looking for obvious sources, we thinking about how to incentivize those existing employers who are already basically running apprenticeships, just not going through the registration process, a combination of financial incentives and making the process easy and not burdensome, is really important. Not talking about kind of huge numbers here, but it's still pretty relevant. So if just 20% of those current unregistered apprenticeship programs ended up registering, we think that's around 60,000 new apprentices a year. And then on the next slide, final one before I pause, check if anyone's got any questions. Another really important area we looked at is retention. So we know we've got a retention and completion issue in apprenticeship. On the latest official data, it's at about 42% nationally. That's from a GEO report last year. Although we know there's kind of massive, earlier this year, we know there's massive variation. We've spoken to many AFA members who have got completion rates closer to 90, 95%. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of variation in the system here. I think there's 2 points to make here. Firstly, the simple one, improving completion improves apprenticeship numbers. We know that it's possible to get to a higher. There's nothing kind of fundamental in the apprenticeship model. It means low completion. Other countries have got higher completion rates, better retention. We know that it's actually increased pretty fast in the US. So from the available data, it's gone up about 7% over the last few years. I was involved in a program in the UK where we grew completion by 5% in 1 year, which is fairly simple policy levers. So this is actually again one of the kind of easier levers we'd recommend people think about if they care about increasing numbers quickly. There's a second point here that's a bit more nuanced, but having low completion means we're making it harder for ourselves with employers. So right now, about half the employers who are hosting apprentices are basically having a bad experience where the apprentice is dropping out, taking another job, or giving up the training. They're not likely to stay in apprenticeship. They're not going to hire another cohort if they're having a bad experience. So in a way, we're making it twice as hard for ourselves by having low completion rates. We're needing to persuade twice as many employers to start apprenticeship programs rather than persuading half as many to continue them. We have better completion rates. So yeah, we'd really think about this as a priority. I might just pause there, see if anyone's got any comments, thoughts, questions on any of the stuff we just went through.
I should just acknowledge that there's plenty of partners to AFA that are doing work on this issue. So we think this needs to be both a systematic question, which is to say, how can our systems and processes be better at improving retention, as well as something that individual programs should be looking at and examining. Chris, maybe you want to jump in here, give a North Carolina perspective.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges I think comes down to how the completion rates are calculated. When kind of putting together our reports for this year, really gave it some thought. And I think historically, maybe they were just looking at cancels against maybe new enrollments, or I'm not exactly sure how it was done, but what I looked at was all cancellations, and then depending on the year that they enrolled, I also included all of the enrollments from that year, right? So we took a holistic view, so that if somebody canceled this year, but they enrolled 3 years ago, I included all cancellations from 3 years ago, so 2022, as well as all enrollments, so that I would get a whole picture. And again, I don't know. I think methodology on that's going to be important, because when I looked at it holistically, our rate was 31% cancellation, so 69% completion, which is in line, frankly, with what I would anticipate.
That's Chris. I think you're spot on that. I think we have a data issue here, and there are different. it sounds simple, but there's different ways to interpret completion and how you cut the data. So there's a bit of a challenge even just getting a clear picture of what's going on out there. Any other questions or comments at this point? Great. I'm going to talk a little bit now about where we think we need to focus policy-wise. What are the most promising levers that can stimulate growth? So this for AFA, this is the number one area that we need to be concentrating on: multi-employer intermediaries. Everything analytically we've looked at tells us that employer adoption is the main barrier to growing apprenticeships. Supply is sufficient, awareness is growing. It's employers hiring apprentices, being aware of apprentices, being persuaded it's a good idea, and hiring that is the barrier. So FA's theory of change is that it's intermediaries, it's practitioners who are able to activate that employer demand, persuade them that apprenticeships are a good thing, help run the programs for them, make it much simpler and easier for them. That's what we've seen in other countries, in England, Canada, France. We have this kind of slightly different intermediary models, but there is always an intermediary that is working across multiple employers. What this slide shows is a breakdown of our kind of current sponsor type, but I think what it really shows is how the kind of aggregation effect of having really good, powerful intermediaries that are capable of running really large programs. So if you look at the size of programs by sponsor type, it's union programs that are running our largest apprenticeship programs, around 150 apprentices. They've obviously, been around for the longest time. They're the kind of developed intermediary. They're, by definition, they're multi-employer intermediaries, and there's various policy levers that mean they have more sustainable funding. The simple sum at the bottom of this slide is if all our sponsors were operating at a similar level. So if all our intermediaries were multi-employer sponsors around similar size to current union programs, we'd have nearly 3 million active apprentices. So we think this is, probably this is the most important thing for us to think about. What are the policies that can lead to that growth of effective group sponsor multi-employer intermediaries? Going on to the next slide. We also think it's really important to show the importance of state policy. It's not just, or maybe even primarily, federal policy that matters. I think you're looking for slide 12, John. Yeah, you got that. Thanks. So this is some analysis from our state report last year. So this is actually last year's data. There's also many caveats on the data. As part of that discussion with Chris shows, there's a lot of issues with the kind of national data on apprenticeships. What this looks at is just the active apprentices as a proportion of the labour force by state. So the point here is just how much variation we've got. We've got a proportion of apprentices in the state labour force ranging from nearly 1% to about 0.15% or so. So that suggests to us there's a lot about how you set up as a state, how your kind of state office is organized, the integration you have with education, your post-secondary education systems, and state funding that really matter for the growth of apprenticeships. And we think we've got, it's quite early days still, but we've got a good sense of what policy is effective. We've put out a state report that goes through quite a lot of that. So yeah, we think state policy is really important.
Harry, I was just going to break in here. We have a couple of questions in the chat, a couple of methodology questions, or at least one methodology question. If I can just go back in this chart here, the union labor is that includes all joint apprenticeship programs, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All right. So is that responsive, Karitsa, to your question? I think so, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. Yep. Sure. And just in the previous chart, there's a question. It's an interesting benchmark, which I don't think we'd ever thought of. So, Cameron, are you on and able to pose your question?
Sure. And I'm sorry if I wasn't, whoops, my camera here. It's playing with me today. Sorry about that. Yeah, I was just curious if this slide is including retention for both OJT and the RTI, or
Great.
as well, yeah,
Yeah.
meaning typically we tend to say apprentices can finish their RTI faster than their on-the-job training.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
that
got it.
that all varies because at least in Michigan, there's been a movement, a shift towards, at least on the academic community college institutions, what's called, gainful employment and credit for prior learning and credit for prior experience, and some technical programs and really a lot of programs with portfolios and credit by exams and stuff like that. So would this also be including the retention of those that are being given credit for prior learning or credit for prior experience, or
Yeah.
both?
Yeah.
Because
Right.
on the form, you can dictate, if they've already completed, 288 hours
Absolutely.
of, RTI, we wouldn't make them repeat that. Just as well as if they've already learned how to bend sheet metal for 500 hours, the employer is not going to make them do another 500 hours of bending
Yeah.
sheet metal.
Yeah.
So Terry, I don't think we ever disaggregated the completion rates between competency-based versus clock time apprenticeships.
No, so this is the 42% here is from some analysis that the GO, the Government Accountability Office, did using Rapids data. And I'm fairly sure they're looking at top down,
Yeah.
did the apprentice get their journey worker certificate? So that would take into account both on a job and RTI. It would be at the end of the whole thing rather than splitting them up.
Yeah.
But just a small point, kind of as Chris was alluding to, like there are different ways that states could interpret this. So even within Rapids, I suspect there's a few different things that are being covered up that can mean it's either higher or lower either way.
Do we have anyone from our partners at Social Finance on the webinar today? I don't know if they're looking at this. Anyway, it's something I'd love to bring back. Cameron, thanks for raising it, and I'd love to bring this back to them to see if there's a way we could disaggregate that and learn a little bit more about it. Anyway, great.
Just to jump in really quick, John, this is Ryan from.
Oh, hey, Ryan, you are here. Hey, great.
Yes, no, this is a great discussion. Unfortunately, nothing too much to offer here. But just to say, I think that's a really great question. Honestly, not something we've really dug into either today in some of our conversations. But I do think it's something we'd like to understand a little bit better. So something we'll take back and we'll to share any learnings here if they come.
Thanks,
up.
Ryan, and thanks, Cameron, for raising. Really helpful.
Yeah.
Are we ready to move on, Harry?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So yeah, a couple more opportunities we wanted to highlight as kind of catalysts for growth. First is community colleges. So we think, this AFA is a massive policy priority. We think we basically got a ready-made infrastructure of apprenticeship sponsors. So we know that community colleges are often, it depends on the state, but they're often delivering a lot of the related instruction of apprentices at the moment. But very few are actually sponsoring. So our previous estimate, slightly out of date now, but I don't think it would have changed massively. There's only around 3% of all apprentices are sponsored by a community college. We really expect this role to grow. Colleges have got the expertise and resourcing, not only on the related instruction side, but also on the kind of navigating the bureaucracy of apprenticeship. And they already had a relationship with local employers that puts them in a really good place to be group sponsors. And then again, the numbers here could be really significant. So if just 5% of all community college enrollments were in apprenticeship, we're looking at nearly another 500,000 apprentices. So we think this is a real kind of priority for policy. How do you kind of incentivize and encourage community colleges to think about apprenticeship first? On the next slide, a similar area we think is really promising is apprenticeship degrees. So internationally, we've seen kind of really like dramatic growth in apprenticeship degrees in the last decade or so. So in England, I think it started in about 2016. Today, something like 6 or 7% of all degrees are apprenticeships. I think it's 5% in Germany. France, I know, is really significant as well. Why this is important in this context, if you go back to that kind of occupational analysis, there are lots of, apprenticeable occupations which will still require a degree. Some of that is about, more maybe cultural or social. Some of that will be like, an actual requirement, perhaps in licensed or regulated professions. So if you're going to be able to feed those pipelines in those professions, we need a apprenticeship degree model that's really really developed, and we're really excited about the work of our friends at Reach and NCAD on growing the apprenticeship degree model. And then final one to flag today is the public sector. So there's around 15% of the workforce across federal, state, and local government. So it's just a big area for us to think about regardless. The interesting thing for us at the moment in kind of the context of US apprenticeship expansion is that public sector covers a huge range of occupations. It represents almost every occupation. And in other countries, we've seen it as a bit of a kind of trailblazer of that occupational expansion when apprenticeships have moved from the, sort of traditional skilled trades into other areas. Often the public sector has kind of come first there. So in England, we set a target, a mandate for 2.3% of all public sector workers to be apprentices. It actually worked pretty well. I think it's now about 2.5%. It wasn't just a target. There was sort of a bunch of accountability measures and reporting and lots of work on it, but it was pretty successful. And of the programs that I was involved in when I was in the UK government, it was also a very efficient way of training. We were involved in workforce planning in healthcare, for example, in the public sector. Apprenticeship ended up being a kind of very efficient way of expanding that workforce. So we think this could be a really big driver. There's some great work going on. Our friends at Opportunity at Work, especially working on skills-based hiring, and also seeing the public sector as kind of a trailblazer there. Apprenticeships really fits into that ethos and that work. If we had a similar target to what the UK did in the US, that 2.3%, again, that's another 500,000 apprentices. Cool. I think so. There's lots to digest there. Quickly summarize, and then we'll open it up again. So just to run through that again, we should be at a far higher level of apprenticeship saturation than we are, around 6 times more apprentices. We don't think the barrier right now is about supply, it's about employer demand. Generating more apprentices, new apprenticeships, we think the biggest sources that's going to come from are increasing the amount of young people, improving occupational diversity, converting unregistered to registered, and increasing retention. And then the really kind of high growth opportunities we think need to be prioritized in policy terms are the growth of multi-employer intermediaries, state level policy, enabling, incentivizing community colleges as sponsors, expanding apprenticeship degrees, and encouraging apprenticeships in the public sector. So that was a bit of a sneak peek of the report that will be out later today. I went through lots of material, lots of different angles there. So I'll open it up for any any points, comments, questions about what you've seen today?
Feel free to raise. Yeah, go ahead.
Barbara.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the presentation and the report. So, especially looking at the last few slides in particular, there is a growing movement around Bachelor of Applied Sciences in many, especially California and in many other states. And it triggers in my mind, like, while this is a growing movement, when there are decisions around how the BAS degrees, where they get provided, what's the labor market info, it feels like trying to think about embedding apprenticeship degrees into BAS like is a no-brainer. I wonder if you could speak to that, especially like John, or if there's anybody that would be able to comment around like are there any accreditation constraints, but I just think this is a potential big opportunity.
I think we agree, and if we've got anyone on from NCAT or REACH or others with perspective, love to have you jump in here. I think the biggest barriers we face are institutional barriers to adoption, and in particular, we saw in our own report on apprenticeship degrees. We saw that the fully integrated degree apprenticeship degree model created lots of challenges for higher education institutions, particularly when you have to work cross-departmentally under a shared governance set of arrangements where you've got faculty senate potentially your apprenticeship could be held hostage by the chairman of the English department, for example. I think those kinds of working through those kinds of challenges and trying to figure out how institutions can navigate their way is certainly one of the barriers that we face. The other is the apprenticeship degrees are like any other apprenticeship. They require an employer. It really requires that there's the capacity for higher education institutions or other intermediaries to deploy this out to employers. And that, especially in 4-year, I think 2-year colleges are better positioned to do that work. They have more tradition about working closely and acting as a service provider to employers. For 4-year institutions, that can be new territory. So anybody else want to add to that response?
I think the one thing I would add, the scalability of apprenticeship degrees outside of a specific state, especially if you're trying to do it through distance education, you're having to navigate things like NC-SARA, for reciprocity, which doesn't really fit a triangle into a square hole. So I think, pushing the USDOL to maybe create a track for apprenticeship degrees and a new reciprocity agreement or something to that effect may be an interesting play here.
Yeah, excellent. And Joanne, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, to that point, Joanne Bueno, State Apprenticeship Director for Arizona. And to Zach's point, I think reciprocity or any of that matter, any sort, coordinate with your state apprenticeship offices, especially if you're working with an SAA. And there's currently more SAA states than there are with the OA states. So definitely align through coordination with the state directors. Along the points of apprenticeship degrees, there needs to be a clarification made that putting a degree on an apprenticeship doesn't add value to the apprenticeship. Apprenticeships are already valuable, so valuable that the work, the experience, the education, the knowledge that is acquired through apprenticeships is worthy of being credited to count towards a degree to enable people who finish apprenticeships move on and have a career advancement because of the credit they get from the richness of what apprenticeships are. And to John's point, these apprenticeships, degree or otherwise, will not be possible without employers, and not just giving the employment, but employers need to be engaged with the design of what these would look like. And Barbara, to answer your question, it's not merely it's no easy task. There's gonna be a lot of perspective shifts, and truly find the champions. Find your champions who would really fight to make a difference, because it'll shake things up. Traditionally, we've been conditioned through generations, culturally and traditionally. There's going to be some changes, and those that have models that have been successful so far really had to challenge a lot of those norms. So find your champions, and those would actually be able to help apprenticeship degrees move forward, or where you want to take them. But it is a possibility.
Joanne, you have a lot of love in this audience, a lot of people agreeing with what you're saying. So thanks for offering that. Appreciate it. Any other thoughts on the apprenticeship degree, or we can go back to the full report for other comments or observations? Of course, I always welcome any additional thoughts on this. Let me just, if I can offer just a couple of sort of concluding remarks, and then we can sort of open it up for whatever else you want to talk about today. But before I do that, Harry, any last words from you before we go to conclusions?
Let me just really quickly pick up Matt's comment of the sidebar, which is, are there any regions of the country succeeding in this area? Which I think,
great. Sorry, I missed that. Yep.
If we're talking about apprenticeship degrees, I think I'm not sure if I think there's some states that have done some really interesting policy things. So I know, for example, Rhode Island passed legislation a few years ago, looking at, how do you make that kind of how do you make it almost automatic that what you learn in an apprenticeship, both your RTI and your OTJ, gives you degree, it becomes credit bearing, gives you degree credit towards a degree. There's definitely another few states. I know California are thinking about similar things. So yeah, there's some states that are thinking about that kind of framework. We're still at quite early days.
Harry, I'm thinking about apprenticeships in general. So
right.
I'm thinking that like I have to go to Germany to see apprenticeships work. I have to go to Switzerland to see apprenticeships working.
Right.
And I'm wondering if there's any region of the country that I can point to and say, wow, if we just did X, we could move the needle on apprenticeships.
So I would say there's lots of states that are doing fantastic jobs. And particularly if you look at growth in the last decades, there's a huge amount of states that have done a really good job. If we're holding ourselves up to where we should be, no state is necessarily there yet, and we're still quite early policy-wise, especially on funding. Like most state funding is, fairly small in the grand scheme of what we need. So I wouldn't necessarily say, yeah, look, there's one region that's nailing it, we should all copy that. That's kind of a point of maturity rather than a criticism.
Super, thank you. And I was very interested to see Hawaii at almost 1% of the workforce as apprentices. And I'm very curious to hear more about those policies, and also the ones that have grown. Like Puerto Rico, while it's the smallest, is also, by a factor of whatever, it's growing really fast. So
really fast.
There's a lot to say on what are the policies that are leading to the growth.
I think January, February study tours to Hawaii or Puerto Rico make a lot of sense. So we'll see if we can work that out. Well, listen, I want to thank everyone for participating in today's session. We will be hanging out for just a general conversation. But just to say, as Harry said at the front end, this is really not offering a growth plan per se. It's not as if we just want to sort of do all these different things. We think these are more indicative of areas where a small amount of attention could have outsized impact on growth rates for apprenticeship. And so just to give you an example of sort of how we see ourselves operationalizing some of this work, you saw some of our are thinking around the public sector jobs. We're intending in the next year to do a report on public sector apprenticeship and really want to hold up and work in partnership with those organizations that are already doing work in this space. The public sector is going to be hiring people for roles. The question is just how are they going to do it? And so we think apprenticeship can be part of the skills answer for public sector roles. Similarly, around community colleges, we know that there's more work to be done there. We'll be doing work in that space. And as we are working on our policy agenda in the states and at the federal level, we see this kind of analysis as helping shape the direction and content of some of those policy recommendations going forward. We welcome additional thoughts and perspectives on this, and so happy to talk with you. Also happy to take this presentation on the road, and so if you've got an audience that you think would be interested in hearing about growth opportunities for apprenticeship, Harry or I or others from AFA would be happy to work with you to figure out if we can present some of these findings to you. More to come on this. Look forward to working with you on growing apprenticeship in the United States. And do look for the report that will be coming out later this afternoon. Thank you very much. Anyone who wants to hang out for an after the webinar talk, happy to do that. Thanks so much.